Let's play hardball. Good evening. I'm Steve Kornacki in for Chris Matthews. Tonight, President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, is in federal custody and will spend the remainder of his days pending trial in jail. Already facing multiple counts of bank fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering, Paul Manafort arrived at a D.C. courthouse this morning, pleading not guilty to new federal charges of witness tampering. The judge in the case then ultimately ruled that the severity of the alleged crime violated the terms of Manafort's bail agreement, saying that allowing his release would, quote, harm the integrity of the justice system. NBC News reports that Manafort did not appear to react to that ruling. He was then immediately taken into custody, giving a quick wave to his wife as he was escorted from the courtroom. Manafort will now be held in pre-trial detention until September. Reacting to the news, Manafort's former client, President Trump, was quick to defend his reputation, saying, quote, wow, what a tough sentence for Paul Manafort, who has represented Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole, and many other top political people in campaigns. Didn't know Manafort was the head of the mob. What about Comey and crooked Hillary and all of the others? Very unfair. Now, Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani is dangling a presidential pardon. Responding to the news of Manafort's incarceration, Giuliani telling the New York Daily News, quote, when the whole thing is over, things might get cleared up with some presidential pardons. Giuliani adding, I don't understand the justification for putting him in jail. You put a guy in jail if he's trying to kill witnesses, not talking to witnesses. However, he later downplayed those comments in an interview with NBC News, saying he would advise against a pardon. Some mixed signals there. Joining me now, Ken Delaney, a national security reporter for NBC News. Michael Schmidt is a reporter with the New York Times and an MSNBC national security contributor. Mimi Rocha is a former assistant U.S. attorney and MSNBC legal analyst. And Caroline Polisi is a federal white-collar criminal defense attorney. Thank you all for being with us. And Ken, let me start with you. Just in terms of the bottom line now, Paul Manafort's in jail. He's probably until September at least now. Explain what exactly it was that caused the judge to make that decision today.
Sure, Steve. It was Paul Manafort's incredibly reckless decision in February to reach out to some potential witnesses in the case against him that involved allegedly illegal lobbying. And he reached out by phone and through encrypted apps, and one of those witnesses was so rattled by this that he immediately called the FBI and turned over these encrypted messages to prosecutors and actually said, look, I think Paul Manafort was trying to tell me to lie. And that was essentially the basis for these allegations. Not only did the prosecution file a motion to revoke Paul Manafort's bail, they filed a separate indictment. They charged him today with obstruction of justice. He pled not guilty in court. But that led Judge Amy Berman Jackson to say, look, the prosecution has already met the standard that I have to follow here, which is probable cause to believe that Paul Manafort committed these crimes. And so she really had no choice. She went through the range of possibilities. She said, look, I'm trying to find out what I could do short of incarcerating you that would deter you from committing these future crimes, and I can't think of anything. You're already wearing an ankle bracelet. She said at one point, this isn't middle school. I can't just take your cell phone. And so she sent him to jail, Steve. And we don't know where he is tonight. We've made attempts to try to figure that out. But a law enforcement official told me that normally somebody who's remanded to custody in Washington would be sent to the D.C. jail. Now, the D.C. jail is a notoriously bad place. It's got a roach and rat problem. It houses murderers and rapists. And it would be just incredible to think of this high-flying Politico who is known for his $7,000 suits to be spending the night in a concrete cell in the Washington, D.C. jail.
Let me just follow on that, just to explain the procedure here for folks like me who are kind of laymen with this. If that is indeed where he is, if that's the normal procedure, would that also then normally, under normal procedure, be the place where somebody in Manafort's situation stays for the next few months?
Well, it could be, but don't forget, he's in the custody of the federal marshals, and they have discretion. They could take him somewhere else. They could decide, for example, that, there is a threat to him. He's a high-profile prisoner. He's better suited in the Alexandria jail, which is where a lot of high-profile, white-collar people end up. And also, he's facing trial in Virginia, so that would put him closer to that venue. We just don't know at this point. The federal marshals are not commenting on his status.
Caroline, Ken is saying there that the judge had no choice. Here's your guy who's facing trial communicating with these witnesses, being told by another judge not to do that. You got Rudy Giuliani out there, who is the president's lawyer now, was the United States attorney 20, 30 years ago in New York. He's saying you only do that when they kill witnesses, not when they talk to witnesses. What's your response to what Giuliani's saying there?
Well, it's not true. I mean, what Ken's referring to, meaning Amy Berman Jackson had no choice, is that under the Bail Reform Act, there's a presumption, a rebuttable presumption by Manafort and his attorneys that have to prove that he's going not to commit crimes when he's out. And she just didn't see that. So I think, you know, also in this decision here, this isn't the first time that this judge has taken Manafort to task. Remember when he tried to ghostwrite that op-ed with Konstantin Kilimnik? Well, Konstantin Kilimnik is the person that is in the superseding indictment that he's alleged to have, you know, reached out to alleged witness tamper. So this isn't like it's a first offense. She really didn't have another choice, I believe.
Michael Schmidt, from the bigger picture standpoint here, legally, it's the question of the Mueller investigation where this all kind of emerges from. How does this development with Paul Manafort today fit into that broader picture of the Mueller investigation and his role in that?
Well, I guess what we're going to find out here is whether Paul Manafort has something to offer or if he really thinks he's been wrongfully charged and wants to go to trial. Mueller is trying to put as much pressure on Manafort as possible to get him to plead. He's been one of the few people to be charged and not do that. The deputy campaign chairman has pled. The former national security advisor has pled. But Manafort has held out. He said, look, I have nothing to give the government. I have done nothing wrong. I want to fight this to the end of the earth. Now he will face the pressure of jail time. This is before the trial. So the question that remains to be seen is what will happen with Manafort? Will he change his view about this trial coming up in September? Would they go to the prosecutors and say, well, maybe we can help you with something else? Or will they continue to buckle down and fight this? And Manafort has been steadfast in that.
Is there any sense what if there were some kind of deal with Manafort, if Manafort were to cooperate, what it is that Mueller thinks he's going to get in particular?
No, and from a very basic standpoint, Mueller may just say, look, I want to know everything that Manafort knows. He was someone that had ties to Eastern Europe, had ties to Russia, played an important role in the campaign. I'm supposed to figure out, was there a counterintelligence issue here? To complete that investigation, I need to sit down with Paul Manafort and know everything that he knows. It could be that simple. They could think that there is something more nefarious. We really don't know, but if you are going to turn over every rock like Mueller has to, getting Manafort's testimony and understanding of what was going on in the campaign. Remember, Manafort was at the meeting at Trump Tower in the summer of 2016 when the Russians offered dirt to the president's son. If you're doing this investigation, to conclude it, you would need to talk to Manafort.
Then, Mimi, the other piece of this today is Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, and his response to this. So his initial response, asked by the New York Daily News there, is to say, hey, ultimately this thing might be resolved with some pardons, seeming to connect the news with Manafort to the idea that, hey, President Trump could pardon him, could pardon others. He then seemed to walk that back. What do you make of what Rudy Giuliani said today?
Well, I mean, he's coming very close, if he isn't already over the line, in terms of getting himself involved in some potential obstruction charges. Because, you know, there are things, Giuliani says things all the time, and it's a little bit hard to take him seriously. But the timing of this, to mention the possibility of pardons at the end of this, right when Manafort has been sent to jail, it's clearly him sending, I won't even say a signal. I mean, it's him shouting across the room, hang in there, you know, pardons coming down the road. And, you know, I understand that there's all sorts of legal and constitutional arguments about, you know, the president has the absolute right to pardon, but the president's lawyer does not have an absolute right to essentially tell a witness, you know, don't cooperate, we're going to give you a pardon. Which is really what he was doing today. So I think Giuliani has just, you know, in his statement about only mob bosses, you know, go to jail for witness tampering, he's a former U.S. attorney. That's very disingenuous. He absolutely knows that's not true, and that this was a serious case of obstruction of justice, and Manafort needed to go in.
Well, Caroline, what do you make of that? Because you could make the argument, I imagine, that from somebody trying to defend Rudy Giuliani here, that, hey, yes, the president has the power to pardon. That's very clear. He can pardon pardon anybody at any time for any reason. So if his lawyer goes out there and simply says, hey, by the way, the president has this sort of unbridled power here, could a case emerge from that?
Well, we don't need to be reminded that he has the sort of unfettered power. That is true that it says so in the Constitution, and there are no limits except you can't pardon. You can't pardon for an impeachment proceeding. You know, we've seen Donald Trump sort of use the pardon power with reckless abandon. You know, Scooter Libby, Dinesh D'Souza, a posthumous pardon for Jack Johnson. I think what he's trying to do is really normalize the pardoning process, even though he does it in a way that's inconsistent with the procedures that prior presidents have done it. Giuliani and he are laying the groundwork to make the pardon seem kind of like just a normal thing that many presidents do. So I think Giuliani's coming at it more from a PR standpoint as opposed to a legal standpoint in that regard.
And as we say, the president criticized that decision by the judge to revoke Paul Manafort's bail. However, in a surprise Q&A earlier this morning, Trump also tried to distance himself from his now incarcerated former campaign chairman.
I think a lot of it's very unfair. I mean, I look at some of them where they go back 12 years. Like Manafort has nothing to do with our campaign. But I tell you, I feel a little badly about it. They went back 12 years to get things that he did 12 years ago. You know, Paul Manafort worked for me for a very short period of time. He worked for me, what, for 49 days or something? A very short period of time.
The correct total number of days that Paul Manafort worked for President Trump, in case you were wondering, during the 2016 campaign. Almost 5 months. It was 144 days. That tenure was longer than Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon. Both of them ended up, of course, with White House jobs. And Trump also praised Manafort on the campaign trail in 2016 a number of times.
I have fantastic people. Paul Manafort just came on. He's great. He doesn't have to do this. Like, I don't have to. He didn't need to do this, but he wanted to. Paul, Corey, Hope. I mean, these people, what we've been doing has been incredible. And Paul Manafort has done an amazing job. He's here someplace. Where's Paul? Paul Manafort. Oh, good. You made it.
And Ken, is there any sense around the president, around his legal team, how they look at Manafort right now?
Well, Steve, you asked the question earlier, what could Paul Manafort give Mueller? And Mike Schmidt rightly answered, we don't know. But informed speculation suggests that he could be a crucial witness in this question of whether the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russian election interference, because he came to the campaign with significant Russian ties. He earned tens of millions of dollars from a Ukrainian politician who was essentially a Russian stooge. And during the campaign, he was trying to monetize his service by offering private briefings to a Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska. And we know that he was in contact with George Papadopoulos, that young aide who was told by a Russian agent that the Russians had hacked the Democratic emails before that became public. So one of the questions is, did Manafort learn about that? Did he discuss that with Donald Trump? Did he discuss the Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump? Was there ever any other kinds of discussions about what the Russians had, what help the Russians were offering to the campaign? Because don't forget, Donald Trump didn't use email. So for Mueller to get the evidence about what Trump knew when, he's going to need witness testimony. And I think that's one of the reasons he's pressing Manafort so hard. He wants his testimony about meetings with Donald Trump.
Caroline, let me just, as a defense attorney, let me just ask you from a strategic standpoint, if you're Paul Manafort's lawyer, if you're anybody else who gets jammed up some way or another in this Mueller investigation who was on Trump's team at some point, is part of your strategy behind the scenes when you see comments like Rudy Giuliani today saying this might ultimately be settled with pardons, is that part of your strategic thinking in putting your defense together that, hey, let's maybe not go too far in terms of making some kind of agreement with prosecutors because there could ultimately be a pardon that obviates everything?
Absolutely not. That should not play any calculus in any criminal defense attorney. I mean, thought process throughout this. If you're Paul Manafort's defense attorney now, you're telling him he's an idiot and why did he do what he did because it was reckless. I tell my clients... Are they
telling him to cut a deal, do you think?
Yes, I think they must be. Look, preparing for trial when your client is in custody, the Bureau of Prisons is supposed to make, federal people that are in detention available for preparing for trial, but it's very difficult to do so. This is going to hurt them in so many ways, and he has 2 trials to prepare for. They're coming up very soon. He's facing a lifetime in prison. Absolutely. I think that, a deal would behoove him in this instance.
And Mimi, just from a prosecutor prosecutor's standpoint, then, okay, look, if Manafort is key to answering a lot of these questions that Mueller presumably has about Russia, about meddling, about 2016, about anything, if he offers potential answers in a lot of those, in terms of giving him a deal from a prosecutor's standpoint, how does that work? Do you get some assurance up front that the information he's going to give you is going to lead to other prosecutions, or do you just take a chance that, hey, maybe the information he provides doesn't lead to anything, but we still kind of cut a favorable deal for him anyway?
Well, it's a process, and if we're talking, if you mean by cutting a deal, if you mean, allowing him to cooperate, the way it would work is Manafort's attorney would say to the government, all right, he wants to come in and talk. It would have what's called a proffer session with a proffer agreement, which means that the statements that he gives at that session cannot be used against him directly to prosecute him. There are some exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. And they would basically just start, asking him questions and listening to what he has to say. And over time, they would make a decision about whether he had information that was useful. And if so, then they would negotiate what's called a cooperation agreement, which is a plea agreement that also gives basically a promise that down the road the government is going to make the judge know and write the judge a letter. It's called a 5K1 letter that lets the judge know about his cooperation. So it's not necessarily negotiating a particular sentence or sort of cutting him a deal. It depends on what the crimes are that he would have to plead guilty to, but it's really more of a process that takes time. It's not like they would say he wants to cooperate and then tomorrow he would, or even in a week, he would be in court pleading guilty.
All right, Mimi Roca, Caroline Polisi, Ken Delaney, and Michael Schmidt, thank you all for being with us. And coming up, President Trump is blasting the Department of Justice report on the Clinton email investigation, but he also says it totally exonerates him. We're going to cut through the president's false claims about the IG report next. Plus, the president says he has solved the North Korea situation. We'll run the numbers on what the public thinks of how he handled that summit this week and how he's handling that issue in general. We're going to try to make sense also of the president's bizarre comment that he wants his people to sit up at attention just like Kim Jong-un's people do. And the President Trump also trying to blame Democrats for his policy of separating children from their parents at the border, even as more Republicans are speaking out against it. And finally, the Hardball Roundtable is here to tell us 3 things you might not know. This is Hardball, where the action is. The pressure continues to mount on President Trump's former attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, in the Southern District of New York. According to court filings, prosecutors have, quote, extracted more than 700 pages of messages sent using encrypted programs on phones seized from Cohen and have reconstructed 16 pages from the contents of a shredding machine. Comes as the Wall Street Journal now reports that Cohen is also being investigated for possible illegal lobbying. Additionally, there are new signs that Cohen may be closer to cooperating with prosecutors. CBS News is reporting that Cohen believes the president and his allies are turning against him and that he is increasingly feeling isolated from Mr. Trump. According to Cohen's associates, he has become, quote, irritated by statements made in the media by the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Here's how the president answered questions about Cohen this morning.
I always liked Michael Cohen. I haven't spoken to Michael in a long time.
Is he still your lawyer?
No, he's not my lawyer, but anymore.
Your personal lawyer, and not.
But I always liked Michael.
Are you?
And he's a good person.
Are you?
And I think he's been. Excuse me. Do you mind if I talk?
I just want to know if you're worried.
Asking me a question. I'm trying to ask.
Just want to know if you're worried if he's going to cooperate with federal investigators.
No, I'm not worried because I did nothing wrong.
And we'll be right back. Welcome back to Hardball. During President Trump's hour-long media blitz this morning, he made a number of inaccurate or misleading statements about the Inspector General's report on the FBI's handling of the 2016 election.
The IG report came out yesterday. The FBI looks bad.
Very bad.
Your FBI.
Well, no, it was Comey, but the top people were horrible. You look at what happened. They were plotting against my election. Probably has never happened like that in terms of intelligence, in terms of anything else. Right. But they were actually plotting against my election.
The headline right now from the Wall Street Journal, DOJ Clinton report blasts Comey and agents, but finds no bias in conclusion.
Well, the end result was wrong. I mean, there was total bias. It was a pretty good report. And then I say that the the IG blew it at the very end with that statement, because when you read the report, it was almost like Comey. He goes point after point about how guilty Hillary is, and then he said, but we're not going to do anything about it. The report, the IG report, was a horror show. I thought that one sentence of conclusion was ridiculous.
Much of what the president said today isn't true. According to the roughly 500-page report, there was, quote, no evidence that improper considerations, including political bias, directly affected the investigation. Trump also falsely claimed the report exonerated him. That's something that was not addressed by the inspector general. Let's watch.
If you read the IG report, I've been totally exonerated. As far as I'm concerned, it had nothing to do. Take a look at it. Take a look at the investigation.
For more, I'm joined by Philip Bump, Washington Post political reporter, and Benjamin Wittes, MSNBC legal analyst and lawfare editor-in-chief from Washington. Philip, let me start with you. Let's be clear what this IG Inspector General report covered. This was about the FBI's handling of the investigation of Hillary Clinton and the email issue in 2016. This was not Trump, Russia, the sort of stuff we talk about in terms of Russia and collusion.
That's exactly right. I mean, it was a little broader than that. I mean, it also included, for example, these text messages that were going back and forth between FBI employees Peter Strzok and Lisa Page. It addressed this other issue of an FBI employee who apparently had given a heads up to John Podesta about this other thing. There's a lot that was in there, but it focused on the campaign. It focused on what had been done during the campaign by the FBI and whether or not there had been a violation of the FBI's prohibitions against bias in their investigations. And what it found, as you just heard, was that there were things that they were worried about, red flags that were raised, but they found that these investigations were not actually tainted by that bias.
Right. So when the president says he's been exonerated, by, is there any sense what he's referring to? Is there something in there that he can hang that on? Is there any sense at all what that reference means?
So I'm extremely skeptical that President Trump spent much time actually reading the document. And what I would guess is that President Trump he makes broad claims and then seizes upon little things to validate them. And so he has two operating theories among many about the Mueller investigation. One is Comey was bad. The other is the FBI was biased. In that report, you can make arguments to both of those points. You can make points, you know, this "We'll stop Trump" text that came out in the report. There's evidence of the FBI bias. Obviously, there was a lot about Comey in there. Comey is bad. Therefore, everything Donald Trump said about Comey and the FBI is accurate. Therefore, Donald Trump is exonerated. I feel as though we're all 3 years into this by now. We have a decent sense of how Donald Trump's brain works. I think that's where he may be going. But there certainly is nothing from a categorical sense that exonerates him about the Russia investigation at all. Yeah,
and Ben Wittes, let me bring you in this, because I know you have a relationship with Jim Comey. I know you've written about him quite a bit. I do want to ask you about the Comey piece of this, because if we separate what the president's saying, what the president's claiming, this report does really drill down on James Comey, his conduct during the 2016 campaign as it relates to the Clinton email investigation, and it's pretty scathing. It accuses him of insubordination at one point. If you go back to that, well, let me ask you about this in particular. This is where they say insubordination. They say that press conference he held in the summer of 2016, where he said he's not going to recommend charges against Hillary Clinton, but then he essentially, in the court of public opinion, it seemed, indicted her anyway. The Clinton people have looked back at that and said that's something that cost her dearly in the 2016 campaign, something he never should have done. And this report is saying that the act of doing that press conference without giving a heads up to the Justice Department represented insubordination. Do you think that's a fair conclusion?
Look, I mean, I think that, you know, Jim did the things he did. I have defended some of them, had anxieties about others. By the way, I was one of a very small number of people to raise anxieties about this publicly, about the substance of that press conference at the time that it happened. You know, he did the things that he did. He's accountable for them. The IG characterizes them the way the IG characterizes them. Jim has responded by saying he respects the IG's work, though he disagrees with the conclusions. There's never been a doubt factually about what happened here. These were tough choices. Jim made the ones that he made, and he has to stand up to history and its judgments in response. And I think he's actually pretty comfortable with that.
What do you make of it, though? I mean, the FBI director giving that press conference in the heat of a campaign, and then again, the one that the Hillary Clinton folks, to this day, Hillary Clinton herself has said publicly, thinks cost her the election, that letter 10 days before the election. What do you think that was proper?
So I think the merits of these questions are very different. I had problems with the press conference at the time that it happened, and I still think that that was not the greatest idea in the world. I also think, by the way, that it was not in the highest traditions of the Justice Department for the Attorney General to play no role in the question of what was said at the end of that investigation. So the problem was both that Comey chose to give that statement, but also the problem was also that the Attorney General chose to just kind of sit there and let him do it. I think something very similar about the October letter. I think it was probably not a great thing to do. And I think the problem was both that Jim took it upon himself to make that announcement, but also that Sally Yates and Loretta Lynch didn't pick up the phone and, knowing he was planning to do it, and say, no, you're actually our subordinate, don't do that. So I think, I think there were a lot of mistakes here, but I'm not, I think the distribution of blame is a little bit broader than the IG describes it, in my view anyway.
All right, Ben Wittes and Philip Bump, thank you both for joining us. And we should note that this weekend, Chris Matthews is going to host a documentary on former FBI Director James Comey. That's going to air this Sunday, 10 p.m. Eastern, right here on MSNBC. And up next, President Trump says he has solved the threat posed by North Korea. But what do voters think about the summit this week? We're going to head over to the big board and show you some brand new numbers on that. Interesting what they have to say. This is Hardball, where the action is.